Welcome everyone. So this is the first session in the things epidemiologists should know sessions. And the idea of these sessions is that it will be talks about things that us population scale epidemiological modelers ought to think more about. So the first one of these talks is by Kevin McConway from the Open University. He's going to be talking about public communication of epidemiological modelling results. There'll be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of each of the talks, and then in addition to that, there's a brief discussion session at the end. So yeah, please feel free to ask questions in that. If you'd like to submit questions on the Slack as the session is ongoing, please do that. If you just put it in the general channel. And otherwise, obviously if you're in the room, then there's an opportunity to ask directly at the end of the talks too. So yeah, thanks everyone. I'm going to pass over to Kevin. Thanks.
Right, thanks for that, Robin. I haven't got much time and I've got a lot of things I want to say, so I better get started. But I'll begin by saying thank you very much for the invitation. This looks like a really interesting meeting. Unfortunately, I can only stay till Wednesday, but I hope it goes well before and after that. Well, as Robin said, this is one of the things that, according to the organisers, epidemiologists should know about. Public communication. So I started by saying, why should this matter to you as people who work in disease modelling and things like that? Well, I hope it isn't necessary to explain why it's important. We're all aware of the huge public interest in disease modelling during the pandemic. And I'd argue that there were sometimes problems because the public didn't get to hear about this from the modellers. They got to hear about it some points from people who didn't understand what the modellers were up to. And there are aspects, people need some understanding of what's behind the things they're asked to pay attention to support behaviour change. That's not the primary thing they need to do to behaviour change, but it's part of it. If you go back before the pandemic, you could argue that interest was too low, and maybe that time will occur again, maybe it won't, but we still need to keep modelling results on the agenda, and in particular to keep the policymakers interested in what we're doing. But that just means that epidemiologists ought to hope that this public communication goes on. But why should you do it? Why should you get involved? Well, you might find it interesting and rewarding. I mean, I have. I've done a lot of it. But the other thing is, if you think it's important, but you don't do it, maybe everyone else will say the same, it won't get done and not enough experts will be involved. But I should point out, there is a downside to being involved. It takes time, depending on where you work. There might not be much recognition for promotion and things like that from your employer. And it can get pretty nasty out there on social media, in tabloid newspapers and so on. You have to be aware of that and you have to have a thick skin. Well, my title is about what I've learned about doing this, and it's personal, and I try to keep personal titles for what I'm talking about, and that is for several reasons, one of which, it's mostly what you might call craft knowledge, a lot of it is. That is, it's probably got as much in common with what my daughter learned when she studied at art school than what I learned when I did a degree in mathematics and studied statistics later. That is, you learn it by doing it, you learn it particularly by doing it badly, making mistakes. And although there is evidence, there's particularly evidence on certain aspects, we heard about some of that later, there are things where it's trial and error, where different people do different things well, and if you ask them to explain why they do it the way they do it, they might not be able to tell you, and they certainly can't tell you whether it'll work for you. So why should you listen to me? I'll point out, I'm not a disease modeler. I'm a generalist applied statistician. I've worked on modeling in all sorts of other fields that I could tell you about. But I also have a long-term interest in communicating statistics to non-experts and also in statistics in the media. I've worked a lot with journalists, with press agencies and press officers. I've also advised bits of government on communicating statistics, so I do know what I'm talking about, at least I've had enough experience. Okay, well, what's this about? That's the public. That's a bit of the public. Actually, there's no such thing as the public. There's a lot of different public groups. We talk about communicating to the public. It's actually better to think that there are different publics, and you might want to talk to them, or better still, let's think of it as communicating to people who aren't your academic and research peers or something of that, or maybe they aren't your students. And once you start thinking about it like that, we can kind of broaden it out to other groups, politicians, government. They don't know about modelling until you tell them about it. People in other areas of science who might be terribly knowledgeable in their area, but don't necessarily know much about what you're doing. It's easy to forget that. So, know your audience. Know your audience, know who you're addressing, and know what you want to tell them. So you need to know who you're aiming at, but actually you also need to know about who's actually going to hear your message. All right, I'm addressing you lot in this room. There are people out there on Slack. You will tell people about this awful talk you heard from me. All sorts of things like that. The message will spread further, and it's always like that, and you can't really control that. Here's just one example of this, of how research results get to the public. And this is just one way of looking at it. There are loads of other routes that I could talk about. So a statistician, one of you, a modeler, does some research, does some analysis, and they produce usual academic output, paper, a talk, a preprint or something, and that's fine, you all know how to do that. What you might not know is that, and what you won't be involved in, some press office at your university, your research centre, the journal, might decide to put out a press release about it. They might not. That's not written by you. Hopefully they let you see it. Most press releases on scientific subjects don't produce stories in the everyday media, or indeed any media, but a journalist might pick it up and write about it. They produce a story. The story will have a headline on it, or if it's on the broadcast news, there'll be something at the beginning of the news which encourages people to listen to that bit or to read that paper. That's written by a different journalist, typically, and then the reader or viewer decides to pay attention to what you just said. So there are all kinds of different people involved. Most of them aren't you, and that can make it very complicated. Between the media release and the story, there might be an independent comment from a scientist or a statistician. I've done a lot of that. If you want to talk to me about that, ask later. And then social media comes in. I could go on for a long time about that, but I won't. It complicates things very much. You can go directly in through social media. That has its own complications. I could tell you an anecdote about that, but there's no time. Uncertainty. Really, because there's so many topics in here, I can only look at headlines. Uncertainty. A few points about uncertainty. Mainly that hardly anything is ever said about it in conventional mass media. So if people are hearing about your work through conventional mass media, they won't know about all these uncertainties that were mentioned before. Now, you might think, well, that'll just mean people will pay no attention to it if I say, well, actually, we don't know this very well. But there is empirical research that including information on uncertainty in media stories doesn't decrease trust or trustworthiness. At least it doesn't decrease it very much, so there is a bit of a trade-off. The details of where you can look up that research are in the notes on the slide if you want to find that. The slides are on Slack and will appear on the website later. But the next point's important. You need to be confident that your audience understands what you mean by your expression of uncertainty, which is a question of how you put it across. And you need to think about how they might use whatever you say about uncertainty. Which can be difficult to predict if you haven't thought about it. And I'll just finish on uncertainty. I once gave a 3-hour workshop on uncertainty. This is not it. Model uncertainty is clearly very important in many disease modelling contexts and often isn't talked about that much, even by modelers, I would argue, even though we all know about it. This is George Box, the well-known Anglo-American statistician. And he said this thing, which I'm sure all of you have seen before. He wasn't talking about stochastic modelling of this kind, but it still applies. All models are wrong, but some models are useful. And of course, the great skill of being a statistician or a stochastic modeler is, or any kind of modeler, mathematical modeler, is you know something about which models are useful and under which circumstances. Now, the thing is that you might imagine that the public out there, whichever public group you're talking about, I would include some scientists in this, would understand this. They would know the model is not the world, the map is not the territory. But actually, there's evidence that they won't understand it unless you tell them, unless you get it across clearly, that this is a model, these are its shortcomings, these are its virtues. And that's not easy to do. And that's just one reason, there are many others, why communication about risk is difficult, because as well as the what you might call factual uncertainties when we come to risk, people's values come into it, your own values might come into it. But at least there's good empirical research on some aspects of communicating risk. There's a whole great long journal on risk communication, for example. And I'll move on to, which isn't quite the last thing I'll talk about, but it's important: trust, trustworthiness, and transparency. This is John Krebs. He's Lord Krebs now. And John Krebs there was appointed in the year 2000 as the first ever head of the UK Food Standards Agency. His background was not in food safety. He was a scientist who worked mostly on animal behaviour. And he was faced with some big crises to do with mad cow disease, if you've heard of that, and to do with a very major outbreak of foot and mouth disease on farms in the UK. Now, his communication strategy, he expressed it like this. This is actually David Spiegelhalter's summary of it. He said you should say what you know, but you should also say what you don't know. That is, talk about the uncertainty. But then you shouldn't stop there. You should go on to say what you're doing to find out more. And in the context of policy, because the Food Standards Agency was a policy agency setting policy, say what the advice to people is in the meantime, but also point out to them that advice might change as new evidence arises. Here's another person who's said a lot about uncertainty, the philosopher Honora O'Neill. She's written a lot of very good stuff, and they're very good TED Talks. There's a very good TED Talk about trust, trustworthiness, and transparency. And the point is that organizations, and in fact individuals, would like to be trusted. It's important for communication, but they can't make people trust them. They have to earn trust by being trustworthy. And one important aspect of being trustworthy is this. It's been called intelligent transparency. That is, yes, you should make the evidence and the models available, but not just by sticking the technical papers on a website somewhere that people can get at. It has to go deeper than that. People have to be able to get at the information, has to be accessible. They should be able to understand it, and whether they can understand it depends on the audience. It should suit their needs. And this one can be a bit awkward. It needs to be accessible, she says. That is, people should be able to examine what you did and assess its quality. Now, if we're talking about a complicated technical model, the public is not going to be able to understand what you did. They just aren't. And what O'Neill says is, well, that's not an issue. They need to be confident that people who do understand the technical stuff can understand it. And they need to be people who can assess it, who they trust, and a bit of a regress there. So this one can be complicated, but you need to bear this in mind. If you're going to be transparent, do it right. That's more or less the last thing I wanted to say, but there are clearly enormous things behind all these different points, and there's a sort of awkwardness about this for people in your position as modelers, as statisticians. There are absolutely lots of books and articles for the final consumers of output from statistical and mathematical analysis and modelling. And some of these are good, some of them aren't so good, but there are a lot of them out there. So if you are a member of some public group, yeah, you could go and read about this. There are also books and articles for journalists and broadcasters on how to report statistics, how to report numbers. And again, some of them are good, some of them are not so good. Now, as a statistician or modeler, you can learn from these, but it's indirect. Things that tell you how to communicate are few and far between. There are quite a lot in some areas, particularly in data visualization, and we've got another talk about that later today, later this morning. And there are generic things, how to do a good presentation, don't do it like me, and things like that. But they're few and far between. Here are a couple of things. I haven't got time to go through all the detail. The slides are on Slack and they will appear later. I'll just mention the top couple of them. There was a meeting here in this room in January last year, of which I was one of the organisers, together with Tom King, another statistician, and Maha Kauri from the Newton Gateway. And most of the talks were recorded, and on the programme page for that meeting, it's still up there, and there are links to the recordings. Very wide audience, very wide set of speakers, including journalists, including broadcasters, including philosophers, including psychologists, including all sorts of people, as well as mathematicians and statisticians. Now, what has grown out of that is a follow-up network, and if you want to know about that, ask me or ask Marianne Freiberger, who's also here. And there's a follow-up meeting organized through that network in November this year. That will be here, communicating mathematical and data sciences. What does success look like? One-day meeting here. And the trouble, a part of this, is that we don't actually know what success looks like in great acreages of this. So I think that's all I'll say about that. You can look at the details on the slide. But finally, one last thing I want to get in. This is a book by Tim Harford, who is an economist and the presenter of a BBC programme that I used to work on for a lot of years called More or Less, which is about numbers, a radio programme. And he's written a lot of popular books, including this one, How to Make the World Add Up, 10 Rules for Thinking Differently About Numbers. This is aimed at the public, and rules 2 to 9 include a lot, 2 to 10, include a lot of the things you'd imagine he might say. But rule 1 is a whole chapter on this, and it doesn't say much about numbers. It doesn't talk about numbers. That's rule 1, search your feelings. And what he says is, if you're a member of the public, you're somebody who's on the receiving end of this stuff, and you are worried about something you read, think about how you're thinking about it. And it kind of extends this to say that people who report on these things, journalists and so on, should do the same. And I'd argue, he doesn't say so much about this because his book's not aimed at people like us, that applies to the producers as well, to the researchers. It's impossible, in my view, to be completely objective about this. If nothing else, you choose what you're going to talk about. And he's not saying this is a big problem. He's just saying it's a big problem if you don't think about it. Kind of bear it in mind. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say. Here's my summary, 6 points. Actually, there should be a final point, which is don't try to get 6 points into a 15-minute talk. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say. So any questions?
Thanks very much. Thanks, Kevin, for a great talk. I think we've got time for one question, if anyone has a question that they would like to ask Kevin.
There's a bit of time for discussion.
There is also, yes, there's also time for discussion at the end. So maybe in that case, we'll leave it for now then. Graham, please.
Yeah, I was just going to make a point. I think the complications that we found as a modelling group in the pandemic was that the fact that we needed to gain the trust of the policymakers, the politicians essentially, but also felt we had to talk to the public. But then of course the politicians are also talking to the public as well. And it was trying to get that triangle to work, which was the main complication, I think. And so the communication isn't just from the scientists to the different publics. It's then how the different publics interact with each other, and especially the policymakers, because they're then making the decisions and wish to communicate that to the public, and that's where I think the different tensions arise.
Yes, and I absolutely couldn't agree more with that. I mean, that is absolutely the case. I did a bit of advising of the people who did data analysis, which went into some of the things that were put across in those things of varying quality, the press conferences that were held commonly by the UK government during this. And the trouble there was the analysts didn't always know very much about communicating to the public, but they were, and we were, not communicating directly to the public either. We were communicating to the people who were going to communicate to the public. They had their own views. Sometimes we did make them change their mind. Often we didn't, and that's an issue. Now, we knew about this, but what to do about it is extremely difficult.
Great. Thanks very much. Thanks, Kevin. Let's thank Kevin again.